actually, if you hadn't put your mask on, the sweat would just come up here and you'd drown. I mean, it's disgusting to talk about. You'd drown in your own sweat, and you'd have to get out before it covered your nostril. Because actually, if you tried to just shake it away or dislodge any of it, you could stand to be infected. Hello, I'm Dr. Javid Abdelmoneim. I'm the International President of MSF Doctors Without Borders. Today, we have some pictures from my time in MSF. I'm grinning because I can already see the first one. And so we'll go through what each of these mean. So this is a picture of me in South Sudan, and it's taken on the runway. I'm in my shorts and flip-flops I think we're about to go out. And what you can see here, so this was spring 2014, around Easter. And what you can see here is that we used to fly mobile clinics out to neglected parts of the country in this sort of post-conflict period as waves of violence sort of traveled through the country. We would follow it or go to parts that didn't still have conflict and then deliver mobile clinics. And we used to have to pack everything that we needed, and because we were flying so often, we would only get there by flying, that we would have airport passes to just go straight onto the tarmac. So we used to drive straight onto the tarmac, load the helicopter or airplane, and go out and do mobile clinics. And it was an incredible project because you were really, really getting out into places that no other organization is. And yeah, look, I was about to say, but we would be camping. You'd have to take our tents, you'd find any derelict buildings or any sort of structure, and you'd put up a fence to have a sort of private area, and then you do the clinic on the other side of the fence. And we'd go, there'd be a doctor, a nurse, a logistician, someone operational, and we'd be left there. You know, the plane would leave and we'd be left there for the next 4 or 5 days, run a mobile clinic, finish our food, see as many patients as we can, pack it all up and fly out, and then go on to the next place. What's funny about this is that you can't quite see probably, but these are basically just structured mosquito nets. So they're not your ordinary tents. It was so hot, and you could see the most glorious Milky Way and sky at night because it was obviously very hot. But a few minutes after I took this picture, suddenly a storm came through and this whole thing was washed away in the next hour, and we all had to huddle and try and sleep on the concrete floor in there, and there was rain coming through the roof. What's actually, worse, and I should point out, is this derelict building was a school, and children didn't have access to schooling, and a lot of sort of the infrastructure of life had been totally disrupted. And this particular population that we were serving had structurally been discriminated against, even from the beginning of the new country. And so they didn't have access to healthcare in the same way any other tribes did in Sudan. And this was a method of discriminating against them. That's why MSF was there, not just because of the war, but this particular tribe were directly excluded from society in that way. So while I was in that project, Ebola in West Africa was declared, and that was the first time Ebola had been in West Africa. Up until then, it had been around Democratic Republic of Congo and some other outbreaks in Sudan and I think Uganda, I forget. So this is a picture of me putting on my personal protective equipment, PPE. And in those days it was, so it's 2014, I went out in September, did a month, and you had to wear double, triple layers of plastic and make sure that no element of skin at all was exposed. What's interesting, or what's to note about this, is if you put the mask on in the wrong way and the goggles, you'd sweat so profusely, but the liquid of your sweat would catch in this duckbill mask. And if you hadn't put it on the right way, it wouldn't be able to flow away. So not only was there a time limit, just due to the severe heat and dehydration, because your Wellingtons would fill with your sweat. actually, if you hadn't put your mask on, the sweat would just come up here and you'd drown. I mean, it's disgusting to talk about. You'd drown in your own sweat, and you'd have to get out before it covered your nostril. Because actually, if you tried to just shake it away or dislodge any of it, you could stand to be infected. So you had to pay real attention to how you put this stuff on. And then don't forget that taking it off after you've been in infected areas is triply dangerous, because then you'd have Ebola virus on this. So there was a meticulous way of getting it off. But of course, the story isn't about me or that. The story there was about having a disease which had affected poor populations for decades, but had no research, so no vaccination, no treatment for it up until that stage. And now there is, because it came, because of the size of that epidemic, it came to risk Western populations, right? And that's the story of Ebola, about neglected diseases and the structure of global health and the inequity that you find in the world, where diseases that affect poor populations or marginalized populations don't get the research and funding and treatments developed in the same way that diseases that affect rich populations. And Ebola was one of them. So, yeah, there were a lot of deaths in that time, a lot of deaths that hit me. Yeah, a few patients that I wish we could have done more for and should have survived and would have been alive today. Aha, okay. This is a picture of me and my team in Ukraine in 2022, after the war started. The bigger, of course, earlier on is Russia had invaded Crimea and a little bit of the Donbass years previously. But in 2022, right at the end of February, there was the major invasion. And this is me with a psychologist, translator, and a fellow doctor. And again, a little bit like the mobile clinics in South Sudan, going by helicopter or plane, here we went across the metro. So in Kharkiv, in this city in the far east at the time, it was surrounded on three sides by Russian troops and being shelled. So it wasn't safe on land. And the metro system, there were three lines, was being used much like, for example, I'm from Britain. So in London during the Blitz, a lot of the population went down to live in the underground for safety from the bombs. Same scenario in Kharkiv in 2022. And a lot of that metro station was built in the Soviet era. So they had ventilation, water, electricity, telecommunications, and the entrances would be closed off. So they were nuclear proof to a degree. Enormous metal doors that when curfew came and the population went in, so we'd get in there just before curfew and we'd spend the next day or two walking through the tunnels, carrying our food and medicines and doing mobile clinics in 2 or 3 stations. So we'd do that whole evening before bedtime. We'd sleep on the platform, walk through the tunnel to the next station, do a daytime clinic, rest a little bit, walk through the tunnel to the next. And so you'd spend 2 days underground, safe from shelling. And then when you needed to restock and go back, we'd go back to base. And then, of course, you'd have to go overground. And then we had our bomb shelter in base. But that's how we minimized risk to ourselves, but really got to the population, gave them healthcare down there in the metro system. And it was cold. You could probably see we're all wearing hats and fleeces and sleeping on the platform. And well, here you've got a picture. So this is an example, if you can see, of people living in tents, mattresses. There's the platform. It's hard marble, but yeah, what an incredible experience to be able to go there and like, there's this element of solidarity in MSF. You see a population in distress, you go to them, you deliver some healthcare, and then make them feel seen. And this was a special project. by spring, I should say, so this was February, March, by about early May, the Russians had been pushed back and weren't quite in shelling distance any longer. And front lines were really much further away. So populations moved back to the city up above ground, but it also meant that we could then access the villages that had been behind front lines for all those months with no healthcare. So it was a very interesting project for me, because the first half, I was there for 4 months. So the first 2 months was underground, in the cold, walking in tunnels in the metro system. As May came and the front line shifted, and we went out to villages and did overground mobile clinics in this glorious sunshine in the countryside of Ukraine. It was such a project of two halves, but still the same essence. Going out to the communities that don't have access to healthcare, taking health to them. Anyway, so that was what it was like to live in a metro station underneath. Anyway, okay. Gaza. Okay, this is a picture of Nasser Hospital. So I was in Nasser, and what you can see there is that the whole front gate is destroyed. A few buildings at the front there destroyed. I arrived to work in Nasser and here's another picture of Nasser now, and actually to see that there's obviously been some destruction to this patient area. Rubble everywhere. That's not a usable patient area. So you've lost an element of the healthcare system there because of some form of explosion one way or another. And of course, what we know now about how Israel has sort of systematically dismantled the healthcare system in Gaza, you can see an element of it there. But here, when I arrived in Nasser in the beginning of June 2024, that was only about a month after it had been, or 3 weeks after it had been reopened, after it had been occupied by the Israeli army and sort of decommissioned. And at that time, in May, then the Rafah border and all of Rafah had been evacuated, it had been closed, and there was active conflict there. So when I arrived in June, Nasser there was still flowing sewage and flooding into the emergency room. You know, so you're working in a hospital where there's destroyed buildings, displaced people, electricity cuts because of fuel blockade, direct attacks on the hospital, medical staff missing because they've been arrested, detained, tortured, killed, supplies in low, we ran out of crutches and didn't have wheelchairs or dressing tables or ibuprofen or gloves or sterile dressings, all of these things that were obstructed and blockaded by Israel. And of course there are bombs flying. So this was what can I say, a project and a half. And I think, of course, why it was so different is that it's a genocide. And it's the first genocide I've worked in. And what I think about now is how we reflect on the things that we've seen as MSF through those 2 years so far. Weaponization of food. So attacks at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF sites that were supposed to be food delivery sites, but were just weaponized, orchestrated killing stations. So we saw thousands of people injured by bullet wounds and stampedes and barbed wire from that, but also malnutrition and acute malnutrition and starvation across our clinics. So weaponized food as a weapon of war, destruction of the healthcare system as I've described, but also destruction of the water and sanitation system, and mass harm to civilians. So at the time that I was there, mass casualty after mass casualty, hundreds and hundreds of injured and killed people, children, women, men, with strikes even in the humanitarian zone. And that's just in one emergency room, right? That's just in Nasser. I'm not saying there were hundreds across all the field hospitals and clinics. That was just in the ER that I worked. And then to put that into context, you'd often be on the ward and you'd hear a wail, and you'd go, and your colleague has just found out that their child has been killed, and this happened at one point 3 times in 5 days. children and husbands and wives of my colleagues being killed, while playing in the street or just in their tent at home. But yeah, so I look at this picture of Nasser, and our unit was just here. This is sort of the way to our burns and trauma unit next to the ER. But just opposite, there was a school that was a displaced site, and on this western edge too, and they both got bombed while I was there too. And there were some injuries and deaths from that. There's a cemetery on the other side of Nasser there, in open land, and people were trying to live there. There's not space. They've been all hemmed in and displaced. But often you'd be coming to work in the morning and you'd just see families have arrived to the morgue, and they would take their dead loved ones wrapped in white sheets out to that cemetery, and there'd just be a stream of them all day. So this picture really, really tells a lot, the destruction, the sewage, wow. This is a picture of a Now hospital in Durman in Khartoum, Sudan. So I worked there twice. I was supposed to work there twice. So the first time I went, I didn't get to Now. But the second time I went, I did, which was this year. And this is a picture of the medical stroke emergency room ward. And why I say medical stroke emergency room ward, it's just that because at the time that I was working there, and for all the time since April 23 till at least February 25, the only working hospital in all of Durman city, right? And so you can see how crowded it is. You're trying to be an emergency room, but there's also mechanics around healthcare that needs to be paid for once you're admitted to hospital versus in the emergency room. And this is something about universal healthcare and how it works in different countries. But it acted as a block. There isn't an economy. People aren't working. The hospital isn't being supplied by the Ministry of Health, right? It's in the middle of a war. So how does the hospital try to even keep the lights on? Yes, we're there giving fuel, and yes, we're there supporting with water repairs and rebuilding and giving medical supplies and training. But even between us, we can't keep a hospital going with the Ministry of Health. So there has to be some payment, but patients can't pay, but the hospital needs some money just to keep itself going. But then doctors wouldn't. You have a heart and it's hard and you've got a patient, and doctors wouldn't want to admit patients to the ward where they'd have to start paying. So they'd keep them in the ER to save the cost for the patient. But then the ER becomes a ward. And so it's also then breaks a hospital system, because you need a space in an emergency room to run a mass casualty. Because as I was there, it happened frequently, a drone attack hits a market. You need to clear out the emergency room and run a mass casualty and have 50, 60 patients come in. So a very difficult place to work, attacks on civilians, attacks on health infrastructure. But what can I say? This hospital, and now it gives me, and then Al Buluk, the pediatric hospital, and Al Saudi, the maternity hospital. So just in the Sudan Armed Forces territory of Durman is where MSF was working in those three hospitals, and that was the project that I was leading. While I worked only in Sudanese Armed Forces territories in those three hospitals, MSF and my colleagues were working in both sides, and that was something that's unique that MSF is able to do. Of course, the Sudanese organizations are working everywhere, and the society response is incredible. And I was really happy to be able to support some of them as well with supplies for food and food kitchens and so forth. But yeah, working in a Now felt like a sea of relative calm when you've got front lines on all sides, actually. So yeah, I'm, especially as a Sudanese, very, very happy that I was able to get there and work in partnership with the Ministry of Health there and Mr. Jamal. I'll always give a shout out to Mr. Jamal, the hospital director. What a force to work with. So if you ever see this, blessings, Mr. Jamal. But yeah, that's at Now Hospital in Umdurman.